The last emperor of China, Puyi, was married 5 times but had no children. Some of his wives were from high nobility, some were commoners. He is the first and only emperor in Chinese history to have been divorced by his wife. Today, let's talk about Puyi's 5 wives. But first, a very brief biography of the last emperor himself. Puyi was born in 1906. When he was 3, he was made emperor of the Qing dynasty. But 6 years later, the Qing dynasty collapsed. Okay, to be fair, the toddler Puyi probably didn't play much role in that collapse. After his abdication, under a special arrangement with the new Republican government, his royal family was still allowed to live in old palace and continue to practice most of the old rituals. 13 years later, they were officially kicked out of the palace. From 1903 to 1945, the Japanese installed Puyi as the puppet ruler of the Japan-controlled Manchukuo Empire in northeast China. That empire was eliminated with Japan's defeat in World War II. Puyi then spent over a decade in prison. In 1959, he was released and spent his final years as an ordinary citizen in Beijing. Puyi's first wife was Empress Wanrong. She was born into a prominent clan of the Manchu ethnicity. In 1922, she married Emperor Puyi. Both were 16 years old. By the time of their marriage, the Qing dynasty had already ended. But as we've seen, the emperor still lived in the palace with full ceremonies and rituals. That's why, even though Wanrong never had an empire to rule, she's still officially recognized as the last empress of China. 2 years later, an army warlord kicked them out of the palace. Wanrong followed her husband and moved into a large mansion. She began smoking copious amounts of opium, and her relationship with Puyi deteriorated significantly. The Japanese eventually installed them as the imperial couple of the puppet Manchukuo Empire. But that didn't help Wanrong's situation. It actually made it worse. Her disdain for her husband Puyi eventually led her to have an affair with a bodyguard, and she became pregnant. On the night of the baby's birth, Puyi ordered the baby to be thrown into a boiler. In August 1945, as Manchukuo was on the verge of collapse, Puyi fled by plane. Wanrong and another concubine were arrested and thrown in prison. A year later, the last empress of China died as a prisoner, under abysmal conditions. She was suffering from malnutrition and opium withdrawal. She was 39 years old. Consort Wenxiu married Puyi at the same time as Empress Wanrong. Wenxiu was born into a noble Mongolian clan. Not long after their marriage, Wenxiu's relationship with Empress Wanrong became unbearable. One reason was jealousy. Both women suspected that Puyi was spending his nights with the other wife. What they didn't know was that he wasn't sleeping with any woman. After the family was forced out of the palace, they settled in a large mansion. However, the emperor and empress still insisted that Wenxiu pay them full ceremonial respects. Eventually, Wenxiu had had enough she decided that freedom and happiness were more important than the status of a consort to a deposed emperor. In 1931, she filed for divorce. One claim she made was that Puyi had never had sex with her. Wen Xiu returned to Beijing and remarried an army general. Unfortunately, the family soon fell into poverty. They had to live in a shabby 10 square meter home. Wen Xiu died in 1953 at the age of 44. Consort Tan Yuling was probably Puyi's favorite wife. It was 1937. Puyi was living a frustrating life as the puppet emperor of the Manchukuo Empire. He was constantly bullied by his Japanese masters. Consort Wen Xiu had divorced him. Empress Wanrong was all but consumed by her opium addiction. The Japanese wanted to find Puyi a wife so that he could have a son. They presented him with several photos of young girls. Puyi chose Tan Yuling. Tan was 17 years old and studying at a high school in Beijing. Her family line traced back to a highly prestigious Manchu clan. Perhaps out of a sense of family duty or tradition, she traveled from Beijing to the capital of Manchukuo and married the 31 years old Puyi. From all accounts, Puyi loved her very much. Maybe not as a romantic husband, but as a loving big brother. She was probably his only solace in a life marked by relentless frustration and turbulence. Tan Yuling died of cystitis in 1942 at the tender age of 22. Puyi was heartbroken. Until his last day, he carried a picture of her with him. On the back side, he had written, "My most beloved Yuling." After Tan Yuling's death, Puyi was once again presented with a bunch of photos of young girls. This time, he chose Li Yuqin, a 15 years old commoner. According to her later memoir, she was simply informed by her school principal that she had been ordered to study at the imperial palace. She also claimed that she and the emperor only had sex once. Li Yuqin's time as a royal consort only lasted 2 years. In August 1945, the Soviet armies toppled the puppet regime. As mentioned earlier, Puyi abandoned his wives and boarded a plane. He was soon captured. The opium-addicted Empress Wanrong died in prison. But consort Li Yuqin survived. She eventually filed for official divorce. After his capture, Puyi was taken to the Tokyo trials to testify against Japanese fascists. He was later transferred to prisons in China. In 1959, he was released and was allowed to live in Beijing as an ordinary citizen. In 1962, the 56 years old Puyi was introduced to Li Shuxian, a 38 years old nurse. They married. Li soon discovered that Puyi lacked certain basic male functionalities. It was probably not a particularly romantic marriage, but it did provide Puyi with some much needed support during the final years of his life. Puyi died of illness on October 17, 1967 at the age of 61. His last wife, Li Shuxian, was by his side. Thank you so much for watching this video. See you next time.